Okay, so we're going to finish with a bit of a experiment. We're going to have a debate between myself and Patrick, which hopefully you all join in with. And I'm going to talk first. So the proposition is that new forms of data will eventually replace traditional forms of data, particularly survey data. I'm talking for this motion. Patrick is going to talk against it. Okay, so my contention is that, as per my introduction to Duncan, the data environment is ever expanding, and the connections between elements of that environment are ever increasing as well, and our capabilities to make those connections are increasing. What's happening as a social process is that data are becoming a digital analogue of our lives. So there's a correspondence between our data and ourselves, and I have a whole other talk about the sort of social science of that, which I'm happy to talk about over lunch with anybody who's interested. Economical models of data transactions open up the possibility of combining individual system control of the data and providing better data, both meeting potential privacy concerns, but also strengthening the relationship between individuals, their data, and the sharing process that can arise from those. Now, this is already happening. We have an economic model of data transactions. Some of it is explicit, so companies such as Core Credit collect data and pay data subjects for those data. But often it's implicit. This is what a loyalty card is. Essentially, you're selling your data to a company which wants that data for some reason, and they give you some marginal benefit in their shop or their service for those data. So the economic models are partly about making those transactions explicit. The whole process is going to potentially open up a new form of data storage, which is the personal data store. Now, these technologies already exist, and it could be a way of doing data society now, if we were so inclined and the resource investment was made. Surveys are not themselves perfect instruments, so we know that. They're potentially getting more difficult, response rates are dropping, and so on. So my proposition is that over the medium term, research will slowly but inexorably move over to other forms of data. In the medium term, surveys will still have a place as control calibration. So it's a methodology for calibrating the issues, undoubted issues, that there are with new forms of data which have been collected for other purposes. A new form of survey will likely emerge, the personal data store harvest. So as I have a data store which represents me, my analogue on the internet, it becomes entirely possible for that, using some sort of avatar system, to respond to requests for my data, both for administrative purposes and indeed survey requests. Now, there's clearly some work to be done before new forms of data can reach their potential in terms of research products. We do need a new methodological framework. We need to think very hard about linkage issues, about notions of the relationships between different types of data. So advanced thinking on data linkage is critical. But more important than that is we need a much deeper understanding of data generating processes. So how have these data been created? Why is this person given this piece of information? Why are some people responding to this and not others? What are the differences that lead to that? So this is the essence of social data science, and these sorts of processes is a significant contribution that social science could make to the burgeoning data and knowledge economy. Okay, that's my 2 minutes, or is it 5 minutes?
Okay, thanks, Mark. I increasingly get cast as the defender of the old-fashioned survey, and that's a a mantle I'm happy to take up. So my basic response overall, before I get into a bit more detail, is that this is an in principle argument, which I think in principle I agree with, but in practice we can't even manage to get Wi-Fi to work in this room. So these technology promises are often not actually delivered, and I think that's likely. I mean, if you go far enough into the future, then perhaps I might agree. But we're talking medium term, whatever that means, 10, 20 years perhaps, I think not. So, I mean, I acknowledge there are limitations and problems with surveys. We all know about response rates going down, representativeness being problematic, increasingly costly to do. And we also know that they've never been a perfect method. The reliance on self-report basically is the real limitation of these things. You know, people don't have the memory ability, they don't have the motivation, the cognitive capacity to answer some of the questions that we would like them to, about their behaviour, their things that they purchase, the things that they do in their spare time, and so on. We often try to measure things using surveys that are inappropriate to use surveys to try and measure, and I think that's a telling point that the new forms of data make well. And at the same, so we've got these bundle of problems with surveys. And we probably overuse them. They're natural recourse most of the time because we're used to doing them. It's the sort of the child with a hammer thinks every problem is a nail. And we've got this new kind of data. The big data is very attractive, exciting. And I prefer the sort of the Bob Groves refers to this as organic data rather than big data. It's a description I prefer because it's not always big, but it's the idea that it's kind of not planned, it's simply given off, if you like. And therefore that's one of the other attractions, that this is something that is there already for us to harvest rather than to plan to collect. So and there are undoubtedly real gains that are already being made. I argue that some of those benefits are perhaps in other disciplinary areas than in the social sciences, but I think that there will be some real research benefits to using this kind of data as we go forward. So what are some of why don't I think that this replacement effect is going to happen? Well, firstly, I think some of the problems with surveys are somewhat overstated. The session I was in earlier was looking at the relationship between response rates and response bias. It's actually not very strong. So one of the lessons we're learning is that we perhaps don't have to be quite so concerned about lower response rates. And if we plan surveys carefully and have external benchmarks and so on, response rates aren't such a big problem as we might have thought they were. I mean, the other thing about surveys is, again, as I said, we kind of get cast as being old-fashioned, knocking on doors and clipboards and so on. But of course, that's really not an accurate representation. Survey research is constantly innovating. It's always having to adapt to social change and to technological change. I'm involved in a survey at the moment of young people where they're completing surveys on their mobile devices. We're getting very fast, very good response rates. New ways of doing surveys present new opportunities. The other real thing, I think, in terms of social science, one of the main barriers to this kind of data, although the way that Mark was describing it, I'll concede that there are some, there's more leeway for those kinds of the sort of data passport, or what did you refer to it as?
Personal data store. Personal
data store. Maybe there's some more, but what we're interested in often is people's beliefs, attitudes, values, and I don't think that anything that I see in the new data world, new data environment, really enables us to get at that very well. If we're trying to sort of do sentiment analysis of Twitter and so on, that's not really getting at people's own reports of their internal psychological states. That's often what we want to know. We want to know how people feel about their lives, their environments, what their motivations, their beliefs about the future are. That's not true of all areas of social science, perhaps less so for economics, for example, but certainly a core function that I find it hard to understand how that could be replaced by these new forms of data. And alongside that, we know that there are real problems with these new kinds of data. There are problems around the ethics of collecting this kind of data. There are problems with coverage. Not everyone uses Twitter, whatever kind of way we're getting this data, we are generally not getting a coverage of the population, and that's pretty core to the sorts of questions that we want to ask. We want to be able to make inferences to a defined population. There's almost a sort of democratic aspect to this. We need, if we're doing the crime survey for England and Wales, and we want to make inferences about how worried people are about crime, we can't miss out a big chunk of the population. Okay, that wouldn't do. And so the sort of coverage issues, I think, are really important. And the access, a lot of this data is commercially owned. We may be able to get it at one point, that may change, definitions change, admin data. Another example where the variables are not defined for research purposes, so are subject to change as benefit systems change and so on. So we know all of these problems, and those are other reasons why I think the idea that they will replace surveys in some simple way is not realistic. We can also ask, actually, is this happening? Can we see this happening now? Are surveys dying out? It's kind of hard, but we've got some data. There's been some surveys done of market research commissioners around the world, and indeed we do find that they're spending a bit less on surveys. Okay, and people have made the argument, oh, well, this shows that surveys are dying out. I think that's actually the wrong inference. It's actually that surveys are getting cheaper. We're doing them more online and so on, so that reduces the cost. And also, there's a huge expansion. It's kind of almost like citizen science. People are doing their own surveys. Organisations are doing their own surveys. I've got a couple of numbers here that Qualtrics does 1 billion surveys annually. Okay. SurveyMonkey has 90 million survey completes per month. Okay, so the opposite is happening, right? We're not seeing a reduction in the number of surveys. We're seeing costs going down because online's making it cheaper, and many, many more surveys, often of dubious quality, I hasten to add, are being done. Another example I like is Facebook. The archetypal kind of, there's this big data. They tweak our feeds and timelines and so on by what people like, and that's a good example of big data. But they find that's not enough. They also do surveys. They do a random survey of their users and ask them, and that they use that information. So it's that sort of idea that it's not replacing so much as supplementing or integrating with. What's going to happen then? I think it's certainly not the case that there's going to be no effect on surveys. There will be at the margins some replacement. An example I'll give would be, travel surveys. I had a PhD student a few years ago who analysed data from the national travel surveys, and these would ask questions along the lines of, how far is it from your house to the nearest bus stop? And you think, why would you ask someone that question if you want to know that? The data's there. So there will be questions like that which will no longer be asked. Other sort of examples would be, we still calculate the retail price index by doing a survey of people and asking them, how much did you pay for an avocado or whatever, and the press always likes to see how the basket of goods changes each year, and that'll be sad if that died out, that tradition of seeing what's come in and gone out of the basket of goods. But it is a bit daft when you've got all these kind of price things on the internet, right, that we should, and the Office for National Statistics are indeed doing a lot of work scraping that data off so that we can see how prices change. But it's not easy. They face real challenges there, because if an apple is in your basket of goods, then this is an apple on Tesco online, right? So they face a lot of difficulties in actually implementing something which, when you first think about it, seems perhaps straightforward. I think maybe the question I was given was surveys and censuses. I think the census might die out because there is always a question about whether we need the psychological or variables that would be difficult to get other than by asking people questions Maybe we don't really need those, and if push came to shove, then we could probably switch to admin systems, and we may well do that. But actually, that would be sad. I think there's still a scientific case for doing the census as we've in the usual way, and so that judgment I think would be one based more on cost than on science. And I guess, you know, we agreed that we wouldn't try to be too kind of, you know, coming to a common position, but I think we probably are closer than we might seem in terms of our view of things. I think the real situation in the future is going to be surveys will continue, but we will be doing both of these things. It won't be so much a replacement other than at the margins. And I'll finish with an example of how big data and surveys can complement one another. I'm a trustee of the Responsible Gambling Trust, and one of the things that we're always trying to do is to understand problem gambling and the things that promote problem gambling and so on. And a lot of the research data that we've had has been surveys, which has all the kinds of limitations that I started off talking about. We knew at the same time that all the bookies have got all this data, you know, people pressing the buttons and gambling on the fixed odd betting terminals and so on. And so we spent a long time getting some of this data, and we got it. It was great big data, you know, 7 billion. I was amazed at how often people gamble in this country. There's 7 billion stakes and so on. And this was given over to a group of researchers to analyse, with, you know, computer scientists, statisticians and so on. And they were trying to find problematic patterns of play, okay? And, well, they analysed the data and they could find patterns of play, but they didn't know whether they were problematic because, you know, how do you tell this? So what do? Well, they got a database of loyalty card holders and did a survey of the loyalty card holders, and they were able to ask them questions about their gambling. Was it a problem? They were able to administer standardised tests which enabled you to identify people as being problem gamblers, and then they were able to line that up with the analysis of the big data to show actually this pattern of play is correlated with having this kind of problem, and that's been a real insight, and I think that's probably more where the future lies than surveys being killed off. That's it.